You're fired for incompetence. That's what my boss said in front of the entire boardroom. The conference table gleamed under fluorescent lights. I could hear keyboards clicking in the distance. My colleagues stared at their laptops. The CFO cleared his throat. I clutched the folder containing my work, smoothed my navy blazer, and chose silence. No defense, no tears. I stood up and walked toward the glass doors. 20 minutes later, the meeting resumed and a phone call cut the silence in half. Here's what happened next. The Manhattan office was buzzing that morning, the kind that hums with deadlines and ambition. My boss Marcus had called an emergency meeting about the Henderson acquisition, the deal that would make or break our quarter. The glass conference room overlooked the Hudson, filled with executives in pressed suits and nervous energy. Every chair around the mahogany table held someone important. Mine apparently held someone disposable. I'd arrived early with 3 hours of prep work, reviewing every clause in the contract Marcus had insisted I finalize. Mom's voice echoed in my head from our last call. Just keep your head down, Sarah. It's not worth the fight. That was all I ever was to her. A warning about workplace politics. Don't make waves. Don't challenge authority. Don't remind anyone you have opinions worth hearing. Growing up, we were the stereotype you see in family dynamics, the peacekeeper and the rebel. My brother Jake had scholarships and startup dreams. I had perfect attendance and overlooked contributions. He'd argue and get respect. I'd comply and get ignored. Mom said I was the responsible one. Dad said I was reliable. Both meant the same thing. Invisible was manageable. The last time I'd stood up to Marcus was 6 months ago. I remember his office smelling like expensive cologne and cold brew. He was blaming our team for missing the quarterly projections, and for once, the frustration felt unbearable. I pointed out that his strategy changes had cost us 3 major clients. Instead of accountability, I got a performance review. When I asked why, he smiled like it was obvious. You need to learn when to speak up, Sarah. And when to stay quiet. That night, I learned there are 2 kinds of silence, being heard and being dismissed. I thought about that review as I walked into the boardroom, heels clicking on polished concrete. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I saw the morning commuters rushing below. Marcus stood at the head of the table, adjusting his Hermes tie, radiating the confidence of someone who'd never been wrong. He looked back once, saw me, and smiled the same way people smile at assistants they won't remember. The meeting started without pleasantries. Marcus pulled up the Henderson contract on the projector. As you can see, he announced, there's been a critical error in the terms. My stomach dropped when I saw the highlighted section. A clause I'd specifically flagged as problematic, one he'd insisted we keep despite my warnings. The room murmured with concern. Legal was shaking their heads. This could cost us millions, the CFO said grimly. Marcus nodded with theatrical disappointment. Which is why we need accountability. His eyes found mine across the table. Sarah was responsible for this section. I blinked. What just happened? The words hung in the air like smoke. Every face turned toward me, expressions ranging from pity to judgment. Behind Marcus, the projector showed my tracked changes, clearly marked warnings he'd overridden. But no one was looking at those. I cleared my throat. Actually, if you check the revision history dash, are you seriously going to blame your mistakes on technology? Marcus interrupted. His voice carried that edge I'd learned to fear. This is exactly the kind of responsibility dodging that got us here. For a second, I said nothing. My throat went tight, the kind of tightness that comes from swallowing too many compromises. The legal team was taking notes. The board members whispered among themselves. Marcus wanted me to crumble, to apologize, to prove his point. I didn't. I just looked at him long enough for his smile to falter. The revision history shows exactly who made those changes, I said quietly. And it wasn't me. His eyes narrowed. Oh, please, Sarah. Not everything's a conspiracy. This is a business meeting. You could at least take accountability for once. I let out a small laugh, the kind that sounds like air escaping from something breaking. You overrode every concern I raised about this clause. What exactly am I taking responsibility for? For a moment, the mask slipped. I saw a flicker of something, panic, maybe. Then he straightened, lifting his chin. You always twist things. Maybe HR was right. You make everything confrontational. HR. The department hit harder than I wanted it to. I pictured my personnel file, probably filled with Marcus's version of events and none of my achievements. I'm not confrontational, I said. You just don't like that I document everything. He rolled his eyes. You sound just like every other disgruntled employee, paranoid and bitter. Face it, Sarah. Nobody needs your negativity here. Not in this room, not ever. He gestured toward the door. Clean out your desk. You're fired for incompetence. The words landed so softly I almost missed how sharp they were. You're fired for incompetence. Like it was mathematics. Like I was a calculation error. I watched him turn back to the projector, dismissing me with his shoulders. Behind him, the contract revision history still glowed on screen, timestamp and user ID clearly visible. For a moment, I considered pointing it out. Then I realized something better. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out a manila folder. The backup documentation I'd printed that morning, a habit that had saved me before. Marcus didn't notice as I slipped it into my bag. If they didn't want the truth in the room, fine. But I wasn't leaving empty-handed. Not this time. I stood up slowly, my reflection caught in the window overlooking the Hudson. Still composed, maybe even dignified if you didn't look too closely. In my bag, the folder felt heavier than it should. I had printed everything the night before, organizing it more carefully than necessary. It wasn't just documentation. It was proof, something that could shatter the narrative Marcus built out of lies. 2 weeks earlier, I'd started copying everything to my personal drive. Not out of paranoia, but preparation. Marcus had been setting me up for months, claiming credit for my work while positioning me as the weak link. What he didn't know was that our IT department automatically tracked every system change. Including the ones he made at 11 p.m. after I'd gone home. Before leaving the conference room, I walked past the presentation screen one more time. The revision history was still visible, Marcus's username highlighted in several recent changes. The legal team looked confused, probably wondering why no one was addressing the obvious discrepancy. I caught the eye of Janet from legal and gave her a small nod toward the screen. My heart wasn't racing anymore. It was steady, calm in a way that felt almost foreign. I gathered my things, straightened my blazer, and walked toward the exit. The Manhattan afternoon hit me with a rush of autumn air. The sidewalk bustled with purpose, a rhythm I no longer felt part of. I could hear the faint echo of the meeting continuing behind me, voices discussing damage control for a mistake they just blamed on the wrong person. For the first time in months, I didn't feel powerless. I reached the lobby, my heels clicking on marble-like punctuation. No dramatic exit, no speech, just the quiet satisfaction of knowing the truth would surface. As the elevator descended, I looked back once at the gleaming office floors, the silhouettes moving behind glass, and whispered to myself, let the evidence speak. 20 minutes later, my phone rang. Janet from legal. Sarah? We need to talk. Can you come back upstairs? There's been a development. Inside the conference room, Marcus was still presenting when Janet's assistant knocked. She entered with a thick folder and whispered something that made the legal team sit up straight. Within minutes, they'd pulled up the complete audit trail on the main screen. Every change was timestamped. Every override was logged. Marcus's user ID appeared next to every modification I'd warned against. The room fell silent as they scrolled through months of evidence, emails where I'd flagged risks, documented meetings where he'd dismissed my concerns, system logs showing he'd made changes after hours. This is interesting, the CFO said slowly. According to this, Sarah identified every problem we're facing today. Marcus's confident posture crumbled. That's not, someone manipulated the timestamps. Sarah had access to my login. Janet shook her head. Actually, she didn't. And we have security footage of you in the office making these changes. Alone. The room erupted in whispers. Phone cameras appeared discreetly. Someone muttered, "This is unbelievable." Marcus lunged for the laptop. You can't trust system logs. Sarah's obviously behind this character assassination. That's when Janet spoke the words that would echo through the office for weeks. Mr. Patterson, based on this evidence, will be conducting a full investigation into your management practices and potential fraud. Please report to HR immediately. The scream came next. Not loud at first, more like air leaving a punctured tire. Marcus stumbled backward, his expensive tie askew. No, you don't understand. She manipulated everything. Sarah's vindictive. She's been plotting this. His voice cracked with each denial. Janet remained calm. The evidence speaks for itself, Marcus. Sarah documented everything properly. You've been taking credit for her work while setting her up to fail. Every face had turned toward him now. The CFO closed his laptop. A junior associate whispered, "Oh my God." Marcus's perfect reputation was dissolving, and he couldn't hold it together anymore. He spun toward the board members. You can't do this to me. Do you know who I am? The chairman, Victoria Sterling, stood slowly near the head table, her expression granite. My performance reviews from the past year showed the opposite of everything you just claimed. You knew, Janet said quietly, her voice cutting through his protests. You knew exactly what you were doing to her. Marcus reached into his briefcase, pulled out his resignation letter that he'd never planned to need, and slammed it on the table. Fine. But this company will regret losing me. I don't think they will, Janet said. Not when they realize how much talent they almost lost because of you. The projector still displayed the audit trail, each timestamp a nail in Marcus's professional coffin. His voice broke completely. She planned this. Sarah's behind all of it. Victoria exhaled slowly. Funny. The only thing Sarah did was her job. Extremely well. Outside, I'd returned to the lobby, phone buzzing with updates. I couldn't hear every word, but I heard the shouting. It came sharp and desperate, echoing down the hallway, followed by the sound of a briefcase slamming shut. The sound I'd never dared to hope for, not out of revenge, but justice. Inside, Marcus's career dissolved into screaming matches and legal threats. You'll regret this, he shouted, voice breaking. The board members filed out, shoulders heavy with the weight of their oversight. No, Marcus, you will. Victoria addressed the remaining staff. Effective immediately, we'll be conducting a comprehensive review of all recent decisions. Sarah Williams will be contacted regarding her immediate reinstatement. Mom reached for her phone when she heard. Sweetheart, maybe you should just move on. Don't enable this, I said firmly, surprising myself. He needed to face consequences. Finally. Dad spoke up for the first time in months. Your daughter was right to stand up for herself. The word stunned Mom into silence. But she only sighed, the sound tired and resigned. I just worry about your future, honey. My future is fine, I replied. I don't compromise my integrity anymore. By the time the office settled and the investigators arrived, Marcus had cleared out his corner office. His awards, once gleaming, now looked hollow. The same hands that had signed my termination papers now clutched cardboard boxes, desperate for dignity that had evaporated. He never saw me return. I was already in the elevator, heading back up. Through the glass conference room, I watched as security escorted him past my former colleagues, whispers trailing behind them. Did you see the evidence? How long was this going on? That poor woman, Sarah. I didn't feel triumph, just validation. I rested my hand against the cool glass and thought about the boardroom. The fluorescent lights that made everything look harsh, the chair that squeaked when Marcus leaned back in false confidence. How it all started with a false accusation. How it ended with the truth displayed for everyone who had ever looked through me. Justice didn't always roar. Sometimes it printed quietly, one document at a time, until the evidence became undeniable. Now they see the real story. The shouting faded, absorbed by corporate carpeting. The office went back to its usual hum. I walked to my old desk, headlights from traffic below washing over the empty workspace, and began to pack. By the time I reached home, the sky was beginning to darken. The subway signs blurred past, the rhythm of the rails steady and low like white noise after years of workplace chaos I'd learned to navigate. My phone buzzed constantly in my bag. 12 missed calls from Marcus, 5 from HR, 2 from numbers I didn't recognize. I checked one message. The quiet was worth more than explanations. When I stepped into my apartment, it smelled faintly of jasmine and possibility. The city outside was settling into evening, office windows glowing like scattered stars. I hung my blazer on the back of a chair and stared at it. The deep navy still pristine, untouched by the chaos. It looked like armor I hadn't known I was wearing. A new message appeared. Please call back, Sarah. We need to discuss your reinstatement package. That was HR. They always reached out when the liability became clear, when the documentation finally mattered. We want to make this right. But making it right meant acknowledging they'd been wrong all along. Every time they'd ignored my concerns, every time they'd backed Marcus's version, every time they'd said, let's move forward. I put the phone face down on the counter and opened my laptop instead. A map of consulting firms blinked back at me, dotted with opportunities in different cities. I picked one somewhere I'd never worked and clicked apply. A fresh start sounded like freedom. Before settling in, I stepped out onto the fire escape. The city air smelled cleaner than it had in months. Across the river, the evening lights painted the skyline in gold and silver. They could keep their reinstatement offers, their apology packages, their promises to do better. I had my integrity now. For the first time in my career, silence didn't mean being overlooked. It meant being strategic. At my job, I was blamed for my boss's mistake. This evening, I'm building my own consulting practice. Same determination, different destination. Back then it was humiliation. Now it's opportunity. Sometimes the loudest justice isn't a confrontation. It's the sound of your own voice saying no to toxic workplaces. They thought I'd always stay, grateful for any treatment. But I don't settle anymore. I don't beg for respect at someone else's company. I build my own. If you've ever been scapegoated by a boss who should have protected you, know this. Fighting back isn't insubordination. It's the beginning of self-respect. Tell me, have you ever had to stand up to a toxic boss?